Good morning, my friends. This is our last day of class, and I will have to say I'm a little disappointed that we only have 13, well, actually 12 students, because one of the students is me. But we may be few in number, but we are large in spirit, right? So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the content to make sure that we have enough time to properly cover everything. And let me share my screen. And as always, I'm going to start with some announcements. Okay, so of course, you know your practical is up. Actually, I'm ahead of myself here. Okay, all right, here is the right page. So practical number 3, your last practical is currently open and it will close tonight at midnight. 50 questions, 42 minutes, no backtracking. The Quizlets are down, so they're not available. I want to encourage you not to wait to the last minute. If you wait to the last minute, then if you have any kind of technical issues or what have you, it's very difficult to remedy those before the exam closes. So I would encourage you, if you haven't taken the practical yet, to within the next, say, 5-6 hours, to go ahead and take it. If you run into any kind of technical difficulties, I'm very flexible and very pragmatic when working through issues with students. Contact me so I can address any of the challenges that you may have. I haven't had a lot of students having challenges, but it does happen from time to time. In addition to your practical, I would also like for you to complete a student course evaluation. Now, this is a survey, which means that it's anonymous. I cannot tell who you are. I can see if you've done it, but I can't match you with your answers. It is supposed to be anonymous so that you can give me candid feedback. I need to know what you liked about the course. I need to know what you liked about the instruction, and I need to know what you didn't like about the course and what you didn't like about the instruction, so that I can take your feedback and improve myself as an instructor and also improve the course. Specifically, I do ask for you to give me some feedback on the pre-labs and also on the Quizlet sets. So please provide me that feedback. That's the first time I used these pre-labs in the current form, and certainly the first time I used the Quizlets for the online labs once we went to online. And I need feedback on how you think that helped you with respect to the lab quizzes and the lab practicals. Let's talk a little bit about your final exam. So your final exam is going to open next Wednesday at 8 a.m. Now, if I get it done before that, I'll open it even earlier, but I'm committing to have it done and ready Wednesday at 8 a.m. and it will close Friday at midnight or 11:59. There are going to be 2 components. The first component, or one component, will be the new material. It'll cover the 3 chapters that we're covering now: respiratory, urinary, and digestive system. There will be 2 parts like exam 3, half multiple choice, half true false. Then there will be a comprehensive portion, 50 questions, multiple choice, all of them from all of the other chapters. And if you go to Blackboard, you'll find a little exam review sheet, which includes the review sheets for the new material, as well as slightly smaller review sheets from all of the previous exams, or previous chapters rather. So we're going to finish the urinary system today, and if you recall, some things you watched online through screencasts, and some things that I shared with you in our synchronous meetings, like the one we're having now. Just to sort of recap, if you go to Blackboard and go to course content and then lecture, you'll see chapter 15, the urinary system. I asked you to watch a screencast on the introduction to the urinary system and also a screencast on the nephron. Then I covered in class on Wednesday the urinary system, starting with urine formation. And we went through the formation of urine. And we also talked about micturition. I didn't make it to water and electrolyte balance, even though the slides are for those are on the slide presentation that I have prepared. So I asked you to cover water and electrolyte balance by looking at a 19-minute screencast, and that's the one here under the homeostasis folder. Here is the YouTube video from the recording of our session on Wednesday. And below this, I'll also post our today's session. So everything that either I covered in class through Blackboard Collaborate Ultra, as well as what I asked you to cover on your own, can be found here under the Chapter 15, the Urinary System folder. Okay, because I went back and forth, I just want to make sure everyone understood where all of the resources were to cover the course content that they're responsible for the urinary system. Any questions about that before we cover acid-base balance, which is going to be the last topic? Okay, so our last and final topic of not only this chapter, but of the semester, will be maintaining acid-base balance. Our learning objectives are: explain the importance of acid-base balance in the human body, list the 3 mechanisms that are responsible for maintaining the normal pH of bodily fluids, and explain buffers. If you recall, I mentioned that the normal pH for blood is in the 7.35 to 7.45 range. This is a relatively narrow range. If your blood pH strays from this range, then you have a homeostatic imbalance, and the body is susceptible to not working correctly and possibly yielding a disease state. So anything above the 7.45 is considered an alkalosis because it's more alkaline or basic than the normal range. Anything below 7.35 is considered an acidosis because it is more acidic than the normal range. However, notice that the normal range is above 7, and 7 is neutral. So the normal range for our blood is slightly alkaline. Now, the challenge in maintaining the pH of our blood in the normal range is that our bodies naturally produce hydrogen ions just as byproducts of normal cellular metabolism. So we just normally produce substances that will tend to decrease our blood pH. Now, before we go any further, let's sort of remind ourselves what pH is. So pH is the measure of the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution. The technical definition, or the mathematical definition, is it's the negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration. Recall that the greater the hydrogen ion concentration, the lower the pH. That sometimes slips students up because pH decreases as the hydrogen ion concentration increases. So acidity increases and pH decreases as hydrogen ion concentration increases. And also remember that the pH scale is a logarithmic scale. So for every pH unit change, there's a 10-fold change in hydrogen ion concentration. So something that has a pH of 5 is 10 times as acidic as something that has a pH of 6. And this is the pH scale here. Again, 7 is neutral. As we decrease from 7 towards 0, hydrogen ion concentration increases and pH decreases. As we increase pH above 7, hydrogen ion concentration decreases and the solution becomes more basic or more alkaline. So why is it so important that pH be maintained between 7.35 and 7.45? Okay, why is pH important? Well, if you remember, functional proteins, their function is dependent on their shape. You can, just like your key, it's your ability to crank your car or to get into your house or to open any lock using a key is dependent on the shape of that key. If that key changes a little bit, it doesn't work as well. If it changes more than a little bit, it may not work at all. The same is true of functional proteins. Functional proteins like antibodies or hemoglobin or enzymes or the proteins that are responsible for transporting substances across the plasma membrane, or all of the other functioning proteins or functional proteins in the body. Their ability to function is based on their shape. If you recall, hydrogen bonds between different functional groups or different amino acids of a protein play a large role in determining the shape of a protein. Hydrogen bonds are important bonds, but they're weak bonds. And a change in pH can disrupt bonds. And if those bonds, those hydrogen bonds are broken, it causes those proteins to change shape, and they may not work as well or work at all. For example, this used to be an image in your book. It's not in your most recent edition, but it basically was illustrating what can happen during the process of denaturation where hydrogen bonds are broken. So on the left here, we have an enzyme, and that enzyme has a particular shape that allows it to bind the active site of a substrate. The little red arrows are pointing to the hydrogen bonds between different amino acids of that protein. Let's say there is a pH change, a significant pH change, and it disrupts those hydrogen bonds. With those hydrogen bonds disrupted, that enzyme is denatured. It completely changes its shape. Now there's no active site to bind the substrate, and therefore the enzyme no longer works. This is an example of why pH is so important and why the body is sensitive to pH, and why if a pH change is significant enough, it can actually cause one to expire, to die. So as I said, normal pH is between 7.35 and 7.45. Above 7.45 is considered a alkalosis. Below that is considered an acidosis. And in terms of absolute numbers, a pH of 7 is the absolute low. Beyond that, below that, the nervous system is depressed to a certain extent that one falls into a coma and can actually die. Absolute high is about 7.8. At that point, the nervous system becomes overexcited. Tetany and convulsions and extreme nervousness can occur. And again, this can result in death, particularly if your diaphragm contracts and doesn't relax. You literally go into respiratory arrest and die. So pH is extremely important. What are some sources of hydrogen ions? So I mentioned that normal metabolism produces hydrogen ions. Well, phosphoric acid, its breakdown of phosphorus, the breakdown of phosphorus containing proteins produces phosphoric acid. When we talked about anaerobic respiration that occurs during aerobic activity, lactic acid can be temporarily produced. That's what gives you that burning sensation when you're exercising. Ketone bodies and other organic acids are produced by the breakdown and metabolism of lipids. And just carbon dioxide mixing with the plasma of blood, which is 90% water, that in and of itself produces carbonic acid, which is an acid. So there are many different sources of hydrogen ions that are the result of just normal metabolism. So obviously, if pH is so important and there's acidic compounds that are produced just from normal everyday metabolism, then obviously the human body is going to have various mechanisms to regulate pH. And there are three different types of these mechanisms. Number one, we have chemical buffers. Chemical buffers are substances that resist changes in pH. They act very quickly, they're immediate, but they are relatively weak. The second mechanism we have for regulating pH is the respiratory system. The respiratory system is stronger than all the chemical buffers put together, but it's a little slower. The respiratory system responds in 1 to 3 minutes. The kidneys are the most effective regulator of blood pH, and but the kidneys are the slowest. They respond in hours to a day or more. Let's look at each of these mechanisms for regulating pH. Okay, so first we're going to explain buffers, and then we're going to rank the three buffering systems by their strength. Okay, let's go back to acids and bases and sort of revisit what they are. Acids are proton donors. Basically, they release hydrogen ions when placed in water. And bases are proton acceptors. They release ions that accept hydrogen ions, pluck them out of solution. So let's look at a couple. So what you're looking at now is a strong acid, hydrochloric acid. Why is hydrochloric acid a strong acid? Well, if we put hydrogen chloride, a solid, into water, what happens is it completely dissociates or ionizes into hydrogen ions and chloride ions. Look at this solution. Notice that there's no HCl in there. It's all hydrogen ions and chloride ions. Now, those hydrogen ions are very reactive. They will react with other compounds, right? They're reactive because they will tend to want to steal an electron from other bonds. And when they do that, they break those bonds. And if those bonds are a part of your clothing or a part of the cells of your body, then they damage those compounds, right? That's why you would never want to drink a solution of hydrochloric acid. Literally, those hydrogen ions, as they move down your throat, would start destroying tissues and cells lining your pharynx. Okay? Let's contrast this with a weak acid. What makes a weak acid weak? Well, if we take the weak acid, carbonic acid, right, basically what you find in soda pop, we find that if it's placed in water, it dissociates poorly. In other words, most of it remains intact H2CO3. Only a small amount actually ionizes into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. That's why you can drink carbonic acid no problem, because there's very few hydrogen ions roaming around that's going to interact with your tissues and cause damage. Okay, so that's the difference between a strong acid and a weak acid. Strong acids dissociate very well or ionize very well. They lead to large numbers or concentrations of hydrogen ions. Weak acids don't dissociate well. Now let's look at bases like sodium hydroxide. This is a strong base. And it's a strong base for the same reason that hydrogen chloride or hydrochloric acid is a strong acid. When placed in water, it dissociates pretty much completely into sodium and hydroxide ions. You find very little intact sodium hydroxide in the solution. These hydroxyl groups, these ions, like the hydrogen ions, are very reactive, and they will break bonds and destroy compounds. And those compounds can be, again, part of your tissues or clothing or other substances. right? That's why sodium hydroxide, you wouldn't want to drink sodium hydroxide or spill it on your skin, because that large concentration of hydroxyl groups would interact with your tissues and cause damage. Okay. Sodium hydroxide, by the way, is one of the active ingredients in oven cleaner. They do a really good job of breaking down those carbon compounds that over time accumulate in the lining of your ovens and stuff. Let's look at a weak base, sodium bicarbonate. Sodium bicarbonate is a weak base. Anyone know what sodium bicarbonate actually is, what the trade name is, or the common name is? Anyone? Think Arm & Hammer. Very good, Eli. Baking soda, right? Baking soda is a weak base, right? So weak that it doesn't harm the body, right? We put it in our food. You can actually put it in, it's found in some toothpastes. It's a weak base, and it's weak because you put it in water, and for the most part, it remains sodium bicarbonate. Very little of it actually dissociates. Okay? Now, why do you care about weak acids and weak bases? Well, they make very good buffers. What is a buffer? A buffer is a chemical that resists changes in pH. A buffer is a chemical that resists changes in pH. How does it do that? Well, a buffer will tend to bind hydrogen ions as the pH drops, and it will tend to release hydrogen ions as the pH rises. And in so doing that, it will resist changes in pH. Let's illustrate that. Okay. All right. So what we have here is with the B, this we have shown here in blue with the big B is a buffer. And let's represent the quote unquote normal range of pH, right, as two hydrogen ions in solution. Okay. Let's say this is the normal pH. Well, what does the buffer do if there were hydrogen ions added to this solution? Okay, so let's say one, I don't know, consumed a great deal of acidic food and your blood was flooded with hydrogen ions. How would a buffer in the blood help keep the pH where it was? Well, the buffer will take up some of those hydrogen ions when those hydrogen ions are in excess. And in so doing, it resists changes in pH, right? So I'm going to go back. We originally had, this was normal pH, and then excess hydrogen ions were added, and the buffer tried to keep pH where it was by taking up some of those hydrogen ions. Now let's say we had the opposite situation. Let's say we had a situation where we had a deficiency of hydrogen ions. The normal range is 2 hydrogen ions. Now we only have 1. Let's say someone had a big tummy ache, and so they just chugged half a container of Tums, right? And what they would do is they would flood their blood with bicarbonate and raise their blood pH. Okay, so now we have an alkaline pH, and the buffer is going to release hydrogen ions to try to resist those changes in pH. So what a buffer does is it resists changes in pH by taking up excess hydrogen ions when there is an excess and releasing them when there is a deficiency. That's how buffers work, right? Now, there are 3 buffer systems in the human body that I want you to be aware of. They are the bicarbonate buffer system, the phosphate buffer system, and the protein buffer system. And I also want you to know their relative strength, and I've listed them in order. The bicarbonate buffer system is the weakest, followed by the phosphate buffer system, and the protein buffer system is the strongest, simply because there's so much protein in the body. All of these buffer systems work by accepting hydrogen ions when there's excess hydrogen ions, and releasing hydrogen ions when there is a deficiency of hydrogen ions. Okay. Now, in the next few slides, I'm going to show you each of these buffer systems, just so you can get an idea of how they work. But I want to make it clear you are not responsible for these details. What I want you to know is the names of the 3 buffer systems and their strength in order: bicarbonate, phosphate, protein. Okay, you will not have to know the details I'm going to show you here. This is just simply so you can understand how they work. So the bicarbonate buffer system consists of a mixture of carbonic acid, H2CO3, and the weak base sodium bicarbonate. How do they work? Well, when sodium bicarbonate, a weak base, encounters a strong acid like hydrochloric acid, it basically converts that strong acid to a weak acid, and you get a salt. So that weak base converts a strong acid to a weak acid and therefore resists changes in pH. What if a strong base was added to a bodily fluid? Well, the weak acid, carbonic acid, would interact with that strong base and convert it to a weak base. Okay, so again, it's resisting changes in pH. Phosphate buffer system works the same way. You have a weak base, interacts with a strong acid to form a weak acid. You have a weak acid, interacts with a strong base to form a weak base. So these buffer systems are converting strong acids and strong bases to weak acids and weak bases. Lastly, we have the protein buffer system. So if we look, and basically the protein buffer system consists of all of the proteins that are in our body. Many of these proteins can donate hydrogen ions, or they can accept hydrogen ions depending on what the pH is. Look at this top equation. So here we have a functional group at the end of a protein. So the protein is represented by R, right? So this is like the end of this long chain of amino acids. We represent R. Well, if pH rises, meaning the hydrogen ion concentration of the solution this protein is in decreases, it can give up that hydrogen ion to try to restore pH or resist changes in pH. Other proteins may have a amine group at the end. And if there is a decrease in pH, that is a deficiency in the number of hydrogen ions, and pH, excuse me, that's not a deficiency, there's an excess number of hydrogen ions and the pH is low, this amine group can take up hydrogen to form an amino group, and thereby it's resisting drops in pH. So this is how these buffer systems work. They take up hydrogen ions when the pH falls, and they release hydrogen ions when the pH increases to try to resist changes in pH. Okay? Many proteins are what are called amphoteric molecules. They can function as both acids and bases. They can give up a hydrogen ions and act as an acid when the pH is high, and they can take up hydrogen ions and act like bases when the pH is low. Okay, so that's how those buffer systems work. Now, chemical buffers act immediately, but they're limited. They're limited by the concentration of compounds that are found in the different bodily fluids. Okay, they act immediately, so they're very quick, but they're relatively weak. The second mechanism for regulating pH we have is the respiratory system. The respiratory system is stronger than all the chemical buffers put together, and they respond a little slower. They take 1 to 3 minutes to respond. And let's look at how that works. Okay, so you can think of the respiratory system as a physiological buffer, right? It's not a chemical buffer, it's a physiological buffer, okay? Its ability, the respiratory system's ability to regulate pH is based on its control of the rate of elimination of carbon dioxide by the lungs. Now, this is an equation that if you haven't already, you're going to want to commit to memory, okay? Because it basically explains how it's necessary in order for you to understand how both the respiratory system as well as the urinary system regulate pH. So let's look at this equation. This is a reversible. This equation represents two reversible reactions. So carbon dioxide, when it interacts with water, forms carbonic acid, right? You bubble carbon dioxide through water, you get carbonic acid, soda pop, right? That carbonic acid then dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. So the higher the concentration of carbon dioxide, the lower the pH, because the greater the hydrogen ion concentration. So as carbon dioxide levels in your blood increase, pH gets lower. Hydrogen ion concentration gets higher, right? If you recall from the respiratory system, that is what your medulla oblongata detects when you hold your breath. And that's what gives you that urge to breathe. You hold your breath, carbon dioxide levels rise, pH levels fall. The medulla oblongata detects that drop in pH and sends impulses to certain parts of your brain that's basically give you the sensation that you need to breathe. Okay? So what produces the carbon dioxide in your body? Well, it's the tissues, of course. Certainly there's a little bit in the air that you breathe, but most of it comes from the tissues that you produce. So the lungs, oh, by the way, this part of the equation is the bicarbonate buffering system, by the way. Okay, so what role does the lungs play here? Well, the lungs control the level of carbon dioxide, right? Tissues produce the carbon dioxide, and then the lungs can increase or decrease the amount of carbon dioxide that is removed from the blood depending on the pH. So when pH increases, the lungs will tend to remove less. When pH decreases, the lungs will try to remove more carbon dioxide to try to maintain blood pH. Okay, let's look at that. So let's say, let's go back to that scenario where you had a stomach ache and you took a lot of antacids, right? Instead of taking 1 or 2 Tums, or how many ever you're supposed to take, you took the whole roll. You just downed them, right? And you flooded your stomach with base, and that's going to cause your blood pH to increase. Okay, if your blood pH increases, as I've shown here on this equation, that causes a drop in the concentration of your hydrogen ions in your blood. How are your lungs going to respond to restore pH? Well, if the problem is the concentration of hydrogen ions in your blood is too low, the lungs are going to decrease the amount of carbon dioxide that they remove from your blood. How they do that? Well, you're going to see a decrease in your respiration rate. You're not going to take as many breaths per minute, and they're going to become more shallow. That's going to decrease the amount of carbon dioxide that's removed from the blood. That's going to shift this equation to the right, so you're going to have an increase and hydrogen ion concentration as the lungs attempt to bring pH back to the normal range. Okay, so someone who downs too many antacids and tends to increase their blood pH, you would expect their respiration rate to fall slightly as their lungs are trying to compensate, right, for that ingestion of excess base. On the flip side, how do the lungs respond to a decrease in blood pH? So here there is a increase in the number of hydrogen ions in the blood. Well, this can happen. if you just hold your breath, right? If you hold your breath for a long period of time, what happens? Carbon dioxide levels rise, hydrogen ion concentration rises in the blood, and pH falls. And when you stop holding your breath, what happens? Well, your respiration rate increases above normal, and the depth of your breaths increases. Why is that? Well, your lungs are trying to remove more carbon dioxide to drop the hydrogen ion concentration in your lungs, in your blood, and bring them back to normal. So that's how the lungs attempt to regulate blood pH. The lungs will remove more carbon dioxide as blood pH falls, and remove less carbon dioxide as pH rises. And this happens all the time without your conscious awareness of it, right? Your lungs are constantly increasing and decreasing their depth and rate in an attempt to regulate blood pH, and you're not even aware of it, okay? Unless you do something like hold your breath for a long period of time, or if you hyperventilate for a long period of time. After that period of hyperventilation ceases, if you monitor your respiration rate and depth, you would actually see that it decreases in both rate and depth. Okay? So buffers can tie up hydrogen ions and release them, but can't eliminate them from the body. They're still there. They're just not roaming around in solution. The lungs can vary carbon dioxide levels, but they can't replenish bicarbonate reserves. But the kidneys, they can do things that the lungs and buffers can't do. They can literally remove acids and bases from the body and have them excreted through the urine. Kidneys can remove phosphoric acid, uric acid, lactic acid, ketone bodies, bicarbonate, right? Any of those substances can literally be removed from the body by the kidneys. So the kidneys are the most powerful regulators of blood pH. They're the slowest. Sometimes it can take hours, sometimes days for their full effects to be felt or to occur, but they are the strongest. Let's look at how they regulate blood pH. So we're going back to this equation, okay? And I'm asking, what if blood pH decreases? So in other words, what if the hydrogen ion concentration increases? How will the kidneys respond? And maybe the situation we have is the lungs can't remove normal amounts of carbon dioxide. Maybe the person has emphysema. Maybe the person has a chronic bronchitis. And so they have high levels of carbon dioxide and therefore high levels of hydrogen ions. What do the kidneys do? The kidneys can literally remove and excrete hydrogen ions in the urine and bring blood pH back up to its normal range. The kidneys can also generate additional bicarbonate, which is a base. So the kidneys are the strongest regulator of blood pH because they can literally remove the hydrogen ions from the blood and produce bicarbonate, which is a base. In fact, you can have a patient that has emphysema or chronic bronchitis, and they have high levels of carbon dioxide in the blood, but their blood pH is normal. And it's normal because their kidneys are compensating for the respiratory insufficiency. The kidneys are excreting the hydrogen ions and keeping blood pH in the normal range. Okay, someone who a patient has emphysema or a chronic bronchitis, and it's advanced, but they have good kidneys, will actually have a normal pH. even though carbon dioxide levels are high. Again, the kidneys are compensating for the lack of efficiency and capacity of the lungs. On the flip side, what if there is an increase in blood pH? Let's say you ate a lot of some kind of alkaline substance, and there's a, right? And now blood pH increases. How does the kidneys respond? Okay, the kidneys respond by excreting bicarbonate ions, and they can reduce the amount of hydrogen ions they excrete. Okay, so they'll leave the hydrogen ions alone to try to get blood pH back up. I'm sorry, get blood pH back down to the normal range. So what you would see is, in these situations, is you'd see blood pH restored to the normal range, and you would see urine pH change. If, for example, there was an increase in the pH of blood, and the kidneys removed more bicarbonate from the blood to restore blood pH, you'd see a drop in the pH of of the urine, as the blood pH was restored to the normal range. If we will go back to the previous screen, in fact, actually, I'll do that. Go back to the previous screen. In this situation, we had someone who, someone had emphysema, they had high levels of carbon dioxide in their blood, but their pH was normal because the hydrogen ions are being removed from the blood by the kidneys. Well, you would expect their urine pH to be low because the kidneys are removing those hydrogen ions from the blood and excreting those into the urine. Okay? So, the urinary system is the most powerful regulator of blood pH. They can excrete acids and hydrogen ions directly. They can also excrete bicarbonate ions if necessary, or generate new bicarbonate ions and release it into the blood. Urine pH varies widely from 4.5 to 8 because of that. Blood pH can be kept in that normal range as the kidneys remove more or less hydrogen ions and bicarbonate from the blood. So in summary, there are 3 mechanisms the body has for regulating pH: chemical buffers, the respiratory system, and the kidneys. The chemical buffer systems are the bicarbonate, phosphate, and protein buffer systems. They use weak acids and weak bases to resist changes in pH and know their relative strengths. Bicarbonate is the weakest, protein is the strongest, and phosphate is intermediate. The respiratory system is a physiological buffer. It helps regulate blood pH by increasing or decreasing the amount of carbon dioxide that's removed from the blood. As pH levels fall, the respiratory system will remove more carbon dioxide. As pH levels increase, the respiratory system will remove less carbon dioxide. The kidneys are also a physiological buffer. They regulate pH by altering the amount of hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions in the plasma. Okay? Questions? Any questions about that before we move on to developmental aspects of the urinary system, which is literally like a couple of slides. Everybody's so quiet. Okay, well, let's finish this off then. Developmental aspects of the urinary system. We're going to describe the general development of the urinary system from infancy to 18 months of age. We're going to describe what happens to the urinary system in old age. So Kidneys go online about the 3rd month of gestation, so about the end of the 1st trimester. In a newborn, the bladder is relatively small, and the capacity to concentrate urine is relatively low. I remember when my first son was a newborn, we have a water softener which uses salt to pull other metals out of the water, and so in the process what it does is it increases the sodium and chloride content of that water, and our pediatrician did not want us to provide that water to our newborn because the newborn didn't have the ability to remove that, sufficiently remove the sodium and chloride from his blood. Instead, we would provide the baby with deionized water. But anyway, that's why you also have. That's one of the reasons why you have to, keep babies very well hydrated, because they can't concentrate their urine, so they will tend to produce large amounts of a relatively dilute urine. I mentioned this earlier, but that external urethral sphincter, the ability to control that doesn't start until about age 18 months, which is why typically prior to that, it doesn't make a lot of sense to try to potty train a child, because they won't have full control of that urethra and external sphincter until about 2 years. Urinary infections are probably about the only common problems of the urinary system before old age, and as you should have learned, that tends to be more of a problem in women compared to men because of the proximity of the anus to the urethral opening. As we get, once we hit old age, and old age we're going to find is, say, over 60, there's a progressive decline in the urinary system in males because of the prostate, which will tend to become enlarged and inflamed, and it will cause urinary retention. In general, as we age, the bladder will also tend to shrink, and this leads to what is called urgency, where the need to void becomes more urgent when you get the feeling that you have to go. And because the bladder is not as large, one tends to need to urinate more frequently. And finally, there is a progressive loss of the ability to control the external urethral sphincter. And so a certain percentage of individuals will become incontinent or have the ability to decide when it's appropriate to void. So this is the end of the urinary system. As this is our last lecture, I want to say that it has been a real pleasure serving as your anatomy and physiology instructor. I hope that you've learned a lot. I hope that I have made the material interesting and, where possible, relevant to your lives and your future careers. Also, I love to hear from my students. I love to hear about what you're doing, what you have done since you left my class. And if you're going into the medical professions and this is a prerequisite for your programs, I like to get feedback on how well you felt this class helped prepare you for the classes that you took in your programs. I like to hear the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's the only way I can make this class more relevant for the students who come after you. So I plan on teaching for probably at least another 8 years. So unless they fire me or I die, please reach out to me by email or by phone. So it's been a pleasure, and I wish you the best of luck in all of your endeavors. So that being that, what questions do you have?